Thanks, everyone. And I make this pithy, hopefully, unusually for me. So yeah, a little bit of background as well for those of you unfamiliar with some of what I've done in the past. I was a banker and an analyst, and then I spent about 8 years inside of a unit of Interpublic called Magna Global. And then I was CMO for another ad tech company, and then I've spent the last 4 years doing this. As a sell-side equity research analyst, I look at the industry through the lens, ultimately of stocks, but I'm still very much focused on the industry and how it's evolving. And really, all things advertising and ultimately marketing related is the lens through which I'm looking at this. Now, when I show what I wanted to focus on, and I do have some data here to show, in the interest of time, I may skip a bit through it, which comes from Magna Global, by the way, and which I guess I would point you to for a lot of great insights. But first, I thought it would be useful to give you my perspective on what was happening and how we got to where we are and where we're going. As someone who wasn't exactly a practitioner in the agency world, but sitting in the middle of it, and around 2004 and 2005, I think there were a lot of companies starting to emerge that tried to get my attention because they thought, well, hey, we're trying to bring some ideas that exist on Wall Street and bring them to advertising. And you guys will understand this, right? And nobody really understood. And they said, oh, that guy Brian, he'll get it. Not realizing that I was a banker and an analyst, not a trader. I had no clue, but that's all right. I got a lot of meetings that turned out to be quite interesting. So I saw a lot of this from that period on, and really more as a student. But understanding some of those origins, I think, helps explain a lot about where we are, especially for some folks who are maybe newer to the industry, maybe didn't live through some of those earlier gestational periods. So what I observed when I tried to study and ask, like, why does this industry exist the way it does? And I learned very quickly that the magazine buyers and magazine sellers that dominated the industry from its earliest days simply decided to port the concepts from one medium to the next. And that meant that all these wonderful possibilities that digital was supposed to bring, even in 2004 and 2005, weren't really commonly being applied. And so you had an industry where it was still growing and people weren't really in a hurry to change much, certainly not among the largest marketers, the largest agencies. But you had a few issues. You had all this tail inventory, so to speak. It was actually, and it still is, even a majority of inventory that was being badly monetized, if it was being monetized at all. You had issues with daisy chaining of inventory between networks, and the exchanges emerging as a solution to that problem. That was one element of it, of course. I think that the idea of targeting was out there, but it was elusive, I think, to the largest marketers. Like, what exactly are we going to do with this data? How are we going to get it? How are we going to use it? And so, you know, what I think there's some appeal to the idea that maybe it might be cheaper. But what occurred to me was it took until the global financial crisis in late 2008. I remember getting calls from large marketers who would ask me, tell me again about this inventory that's available for 1/10 of the price. And it was through that lens that I noticed advertisers taking a real interest in programmatic advertising. And so what really started to cause a takeoff in my observation was it was cheap. And sure, there's a lot that you could do with it, but it was cheap. Did I mention it was cheap? And I think there was a deflationary element to all digital advertising that followed from it. Agencies obviously pushed hard because I think, I still remember the day that the advertising.com IPO was registered, and colleagues of mine would look at the numbers and they'd go, oh my God, why aren't we playing in this? So you had that interest too. You certainly had a lot of publishers on the premium side who were, I think, really not quite embracing of it, but that was okay. If you were the advertiser and the agency, there's plenty of other inventory to work with. Did I mention it was cheap? And it felt like this really is what got things going. And that's okay, at least in the earlier stages. Now, to the size of the market, as I mentioned, Magna Global, I think, puts out some of the best, most detailed work on this. I have nothing to do with it, but I know there's someone from Magna here. But anyways, shocker, programmatic advertising took off. And it was really, again, my observation was that the global financial crisis pushed the large marketers to really look at ways to drive their spending into this space. And that led to marketers looking for ways to apply data to make it better. And they become more targeted and to start to realize some of the promises of digital that were out there 10 years earlier. Now, the trends haven't played out equally well in different countries around the world. I certainly, not called out here, I certainly noted how a market like the Netherlands was fascinating how quickly they adopted it and embraced programmatic advertising from where I was sitting at the time, at least. Since then, I think we've seen some other markets which have taken off in different ways. Again, I'll slide through these. Obviously, US is the most important market. The UK is a secondary one, and you have a few others like Australia. You do have laggard markets, which are interesting. Germany's long been an interesting anomaly of sorts because it is such a large market. It should be so sophisticated. A handful of sellers, and you'd think that more automation would ultimately be good, but it has been a bit slow to take off. It does seem like that's changing at this time. So anyways, we have this market that's starting to take off. And as it's taken off and as marketers put more scrutiny into it, they've realized that, oh, guess what? It's not as perfect as what we were sold. And so all these problems that I think most of you live with or have to manage on a daily basis are out there. The real issue is, of course, how is it going to get resolved? And I think that most problems have solutions. It takes time. I think that the wonderful thing is that budgets are generally pretty static with respect to the problems. I constantly am asking marketers when I interact with them, are you aware of viewability problems? Are you aware of bots? Are you aware of ad quality issues? And if you are aware, does that cause you to change your budgets? Generally speaking, the answer seems to be no. I realize it's a bit of a risk, that there are still amazingly some very large marketers who are unaware of these issues. I'm not that concerned that it will cause budgets to fall off, at least not right away. And that's what gives time to fix some of these problems that are out there. I think a more interesting issue is, of course, what happens with some of the walled gardens. The idea that Facebook and Google, which clearly are, they want to keep as much data inside of their walls. They don't want to make it comparable outside. And they want the advertisers to use the tools that work with their inventory. I really don't see anything getting in the way of that for Google and Facebook. And they are hegemons for the industry. And I think that they only reinforce their positions with every passing day, week, month, and year. And that does produce interesting opportunities and alternatives for someone. Certainly AOL Verizon is in a good position to be that alternative if they continue to invest. But it will also mean that all independent tools will have an important role for the publishers not named Google and not named Facebook, because obviously there is a valuable inventory out there. There is room to apply data and automating workflows. And eventually we're kind of going full circle back to the dawn of the magazine era of the web, where premium content is in fact being valued like it should be as something premium, and programmatic strategies are being applied to that inventory. I certainly saw the study that was referred to earlier by the premium publishers talking about the lack of fraud, relatively speaking, among their inventory. I think that's going to be a pretty strong selling point going forward. So you'll still have a very strong role for the premium publishers in a programmatic world. What I think gets really interesting is how programmatic concepts become applied to other media. One thing I think a lot of us do too often is that we conflate RTB and real-time bidding with programmatic, and I don't think the two necessarily have to go hand in hand. I think when we think of how television is evolving, there's a tremendous opportunity for what we'll call programmatic activities. And in this case, by programmatic, I just mean the application of more data and more automation to the medium. I think that's going to be a gradual evolutionary thing. And maybe that's the one most important takeaway I'd offer from all the years that I've been paying attention to this space and others as well, is that you mostly have evolution, not revolution, when it comes to advertising, because the large institutions that are advertisers and agencies and publishers can't move that fast for the most part. And that's okay, because it gives time for problems to be worked through. But the issue is, of course, occasionally you do get a global financial crisis, or you have some catalytic event. You can't predict when it will happen. That can accelerate the process. Otherwise, it's just a continuum forward of more automation and more data in all of advertising. With that, I'll leave it here, and feel free to reach us if you have any questions, comments. Brian@pvtl.com. Thanks very much.
Brian, thank you so much. The perspective of the analyst and the research is at the foundation of how we think about strategy. One of the key things that he mentioned is, again, how are we beginning to start looking forward into the markets that we operate in, or as our theme for this conference implies, getting ahead of real time.